This is episode 12, where we ask, in a world driven by data and code, does war still make sense? Or is it just a deadly relic of the past? Welcome to the deep dive. We're taking a close look at a challenging but incredibly relevant topic today.
And our source material for this one is particularly thought-provoking. We're pulling insights from Yuval Noah Harari's 21 Lessons for the 21st Century, specifically Chapter 11, which he simply titles War.
Okay, let's unpack this. Harari presents a really compelling argument that large-scale war between major global powers might actually be becoming obsolete in the 21st century.
Right. Absolute. But, and this is the key tension.
He also stresses that it remains a very real and, well, dangerous possibility.
Exactly. So our mission here is to understand the core reasons he gives for both sides of that coin.
Looking at the economic shifts, the technological realities, and, crucially, the human factors he brings up.
He actually starts with something that might surprise some people. He points out that the last few decades have, statistically speaking, been the most peaceful era in human history.
Really? Despite everything we see.
Yeah, he notes that violence now accounts for only about 1% of human deaths globally, which is a stark contrast to earlier periods, much higher percentages back then.
That's a perspective that's easy to lose sight of, definitely, with the current news cycle.
Oh, absolutely. And Harari acknowledges that. He says, look, since around 2008, the international situation has deteriorated. Talk of war is back. Military budgets are climbing again.
There's definitely a feeling of tension, right?
Yeah.
Maybe even a fear, he mentions, like 1914, that some spark could just ignite a huge conflict.
But what's fascinating is Harari's analysis of a key difference between, say, 2018 when he was writing and 1914.
What's the main difference he sees?
Well, back then, war held immense appeal for elites. Why? Because there were clear, recent examples of successful wars bringing very concrete economic prosperity and political power.
Ah, okay. So it wasn't just abstract nationalism, it was seen as profitable.
Precisely. He gives some powerful historical examples. Think about empires like the Assyrians or the Qin dynasty in China, built fundamentally through conquest.
They literally conquered their way to power and wealth.
Right. And even in 1914, the major world powers owed their status largely to military victories. Imperial Japan rising after defeating China and Russia, Germany dominating Europe after wars against Austria-Hungary and France, Britain's vast empire.
Built on what they called splendid little wars.
Exactly. Like Britain invading Egypt in 1882, he points out they lost just 57 soldiers at the Battle of Tel el-Kebir.
57, that's it.
That's it. And they gained control of the Nile Valley and the Suez Canal for decades. Vital assets.
Why? Right.
Or the U.S. conquest of Mexico in 1846. Added territory larger than several European countries combined.
And the cost.
About 13,000 American lives, according to Harari. He starkly calls that the bargain of the millennium.
So those were clear cases where war could be high profit, low damage for the victor.
Yes. But Harari argues global elites in the 21st century have solid reasons to believe that specific type of war is fundamentally, well, extinct when it comes to major powers fighting each other.
Okay, so if the old logic was conquer for profit, what changed? That's the big question.
Harari makes a really striking point about how wealth is created today. In the past, the main economic assets were material, right? Land, gold mines, fertile valleys, cities to loot, people to enslave.
Things you could physically seize by force.
Exactly. The Romans got rich selling captives. Americans benefited from California gold, Texas land, tangible stuff.
But now?
But Harari argues today the primary economic assets are knowledge-based.
Okay, like what specifically?
Think technical know-how, institutional structures, intellectual property, data, code, all that intangible stuff.
Right. The drivers of modern economies.
So he poses this really intriguing question. How exactly do you conquer knowledge through war?
Yeah, you can't loot Silicon Valley with an invading army. There aren't silicon mines there to seize, as he says.
Precisely. The actual value isn't in the physical buildings or even the people necessarily. It's in the collective knowledge, the networks, the IP. For a major power like China or the United States, he points out, the kind of money ISIS made looting banks or oil wells, maybe a few $100 million. It's peanuts.
Insignificant compared to their multi-trillion-dollar economies.
Utterly.
Yeah.
Spending trillions on a war against another major power, with all the inevitable damage and disruption to global trade, you simply couldn't offset that cost through conquest alone anymore.
So that core idea that wealth isn't tied to physical territory in the same way, That really undermines the traditional logic of conquest between advanced economies.
Fundamentally, it makes it far less relevant for economic game.
And then, of course, there's the technology of war itself.
Oh, yeah. Harari highlights that the atom bomb just changed everything, turned victory in a world war into what he calls collective suicide.
Right. Since 1945, the superpowers have gone to extraordinary lengths to avoid direct confrontation.
They only engage in proxy conflicts, lower stake stuff, where the nuclear threshold isn't directly threatened.
And even attacking a smaller nation with nukes is incredibly unattractive.
Because you have no guarantee they wouldn't use them if they were facing total defeat, assuming they had them. It's a terrifying gamble.
And speaking of technology, cyber warfare, that adds another dimension.
A huge one. Harari argues this makes things even tougher for potential conquerors. In the past, like the British in Sudan or the US in Iraq, you could fight wars far away. Your own homeland wasn't at significant direct risk from the fighting itself.
But not anymore.
Not with sophisticated cyber capabilities. Harari notes that a country with even, moderate skills could potentially bring the war home in minutes.
How so?
Malwares, logic bombs. They could disrupt air traffic control, cause train crashes, take down power grids in major cities, Dallas, Philadelphia, Michigan.
Wherever. So the battlefield is suddenly everywhere.
Yeah. Potentially, yes. So you see the shift Harari outlines. Warfare used to be potentially low damage to the victor and high profit. Think Hastings or the Mexican-American War.
Got it.
Now, with nukes and cyber, for major powers fighting each other, it's become high damage to everyone involved and low profit.
You can destroy, but you can't build profitable empires that way anymore.
That seems to be his argument. And Harari suggests this fundamental change war becoming economically less rewarding and technologically more destructive is perhaps our best argument for why large-scale conflict might be avoided.
It forces caution, even on leaders who talk tough.
It seems to compel them, yes. They have to be extremely careful about actually starting a major war because the downsides are just so immense and unpredictable.
And you see this playing out in the real-world examples he brings up.
Yeah, he points to the U.S. victory over the Soviet Union, not achieved through a major military war, right? It was economic ideological pressure.
And China.
China, the major rising power, ascended strictly through economic means, actively avoiding armed conflict since 1979. It's following the post-1945 model of Japan and Germany becoming economic powerhouses after abandoning imperial expansion, not the pre-1914 model.
That's a key distinction.
Yeah.
What about more volatile regions?
Even there, he suggests the logic holds. Iran, for instance, hasn't really gained from direct conflict like the Iran-Iraq war. It avoids invading neighbors. It's become a regional player more because its rivals stumbled, not through conquest.
And Israel.
He argues Israel has prospered despite its war since 1967, not because of the occupied territories, which he sees as burdens. Its recent improved position, he suggests, came partly from avoiding direct military involvement in things like the Syrian civil war.
Interesting take.
He has that line that Israeli politicians know there is little to be won from war, just like leaders in the U.S., China, Germany, Japan, and Iran.
The strategy seems to be sit back and let others do the fighting.
That seems to be the dominant calculation among major players, yes.
Okay, but what about Russia? The annexation of Crimea in 2014, that looked a bit like old-style conquest.
It did, on the surface. Harari examines this. He acknowledges it looked like a success gaining strategic territory with minimal resistance. But he also notes it relied on extraordinary circumstances. A unique situation unlikely to be repeated easily.
And when they tried to apply that playbook elsewhere in Ukraine,
It resulted in an unproductive stalemate, he argues. Created a determined enemy, not a compliant ally.
and economically.
Harari contrasts the economic stagnation of victorious Russia with the immense economic progress of peaceful China during that same period. The comparison isn't flattering for the war model.
So despite the strong rhetoric, maybe the Russian elite understands the real costs, too.
Harari suggests so. He argues Putin's approach is actually quite cautious, compares him to a playground bully who picks on weaker kids, but is careful not to provoke the really big ones.
So not the bold, expansionist spirit of, like, Stalin or Genghis Khan.
Doesn't seem like it. It hints at an understanding that military power has limits in the 21st century. Any successful conflict probably has to be limited in scope and objective.
He also brings up the idea that maybe recent Russian actions could be seen as defensive.
Yeah, he presents that perspective too. A reaction to NATO expansion after the USSR dissolved peacefully, rather than the start of some grand imperial project. It's a viewpoint to consider.
And he points out Russia's relative weaknesses compared to the Soviet era.
Right. Significantly weaker. Population, economy dwarfed by the US and EU combined, crucially lacking the edge in vital tech sectors like IT, biotech. Too reliant on natural resources.
Plus, no universal ideology like communism.
Exactly. Authoritarian nationalism might be spreading, he notes, but it's inherently divisive. Polish nationalism and Russian nationalism, for instance, are fundamentally opposed. They don't unite easily.
Okay, so based on all these factors, economic shifts, tech changes, geopolitical realities, Harari concludes it seems genuinely unlikely Russia is planning some kind of global conquest campaign.
Yes, he expresses hope that Crimea remains an isolated incident, not the start of something bigger.
But there's always a but, isn't there?
There is, and this is the critical caveat, the thing he warns we must not underestimate.
Which is?
Human stupidity.
Ah, right. The great unpredictable variable.
Alas, yes. Even if war is demonstrably unprofitable and potentially catastrophic for major powers, that doesn't give us an absolute guarantee of peace.
Because
Humans, both individually and collectively, are unfortunately prone to self-destructive behavior.
he uses the example of the Axis powers in World War II, right?
He does. Harari argues that even back then, in 1939, war was likely counterproductive for Germany, Italy, and Japan. And the truly astounding part, he says, is how well those countries prospered after their devastating defeat and the complete annihilation of their empires.
Which highlights a massive miscalculation on their part beforehand.
A profound one, as Harari sees it. Japanese elites in the 1930s genuinely believed they needed mainland conquests for economic survival.
Yet their economic miracle only happened after they lost those conquests.
Exactly. So the point is, leaders may not be clinically mad, but they are operating within a world that's just far too complex for human rationality to fully grasp.
That inherent complexity means even rational leaders can make.
Very stupid decisions, as he puts it.
Okay, so given this risk, what does Harari advise? How should we think about the possibility of future wars?
He advises us to consciously avoid two extremes.
What are they?
One extreme is assuming war is inevitable. This, he warns, is exceedingly dangerous.
Why?
Because it easily becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. If countries and leaders genuinely believe war is coming, what do?
They arm up, refuse compromise, see enemies everywhere.
Exactly, and that behavior practically guarantees that conflict will happen eventually.
Okay, so don't assume it's inevitable. What's the other extreme?
On the other hand, he cautions it's incredibly naive to assume war is simply impossible.
Even if it seems totally irrational and catastrophic for everyone?
Even then, Harari reminds us that no God and no law of nature protects us from human stupidity. It's always a factor.
That raises a thought then. If human stupidity is this powerful, this potentially destructive, is there anything that might offer a potential remedy, or at least a counterbalance?
Harari does offer an idea from the source. He suggests humility.
Humility.
Yeah.
How does that connect to preventing war?
Sure.
That seems unexpected.
Well, he argues that so much of the tension, especially national, religious, and cultural conflict, is fueled by a kind of grandiose feeling. The belief that my nation, my religion, my culture is uniquely important, superior, somehow special.
And therefore its interests automatically trump everyone else's, or even the broader interests of humanity itself.
Precisely that sense of exceptionalism.
Ah, I see. So the idea is that if nations, religions, cultural groups could adopt a more realistic, maybe more modest view of their actual place in the world,
And the vastness of history and the planet.
it might reduce the arrogance, the entitlement, the tension that blinds leaders and populations to the real cost of conflict.
That seems to be the implication. It might help counter the irrational drives that push towards war, even when it makes no objective sense.
Stepping back from that self-importance. Interesting.
Definitely something to think about.
Okay, so let's just quickly loop back to the core tension Harari explores in this war chapter. He makes a strong case that for major powers in this century, war looks increasingly unprofitable and dangerous.
Largely due to the shift in economic assets away from material stuff towards knowledge and the devastating nature of modern tech, nukes, cyber, all of it.
And yet, the threat persists. According to the source, that threat comes primarily from human factors.
Right. The potential for miscalculation, for self-destructive choices, what he calls the march of folly, human fallibility, essentially.
So revisiting our central question for this deep dive, does war still make sense?
Based on Harari's analysis, for major powers, looking at economics and technology, less and less so. It looks increasingly irrational. However, the enduring risk of human folly, of stupidity, means we absolutely cannot dismiss the possibility. It remains a danger.
And that's exactly why he stresses avoiding those two extremes we talked about.
Don't assume war is inevitable, because believing that can help make it happen.
But equally, don't assume it's impossible, because that ignores the powerful, unpredictable element of human nature.
A difficult balance to strike.
It is. And for you, the listener, Harari leaves us with that thought-provoking idea as a potential way, maybe, to push back against the human stupidity that contributes to conflict.
That idea of humility.
Yeah. What might it truly look like for individuals, for groups, for nations, to move away from that sense of grandeur, to adopt a more realistic, perhaps more modest view of their place in the world?
It's certainly something to keep reflecting on long after this deep dive is over.